Okay, I think we are alive. Live, sorry, not alive, live. Let me check at YouTube just in case because of the tool. Yes. Let me check. Let me check with the team. Yes, we are live. Yes, yes, we are live. Sorry, check with the. Okay. So
Always good.
hello everyone, welcome and thank you all for joining us today at our second webinar at Testinui. My name is Claudia and I am a co-organizer of Testinui conference. In case this is your first time participating in a Testinui activity, we are a community in which we promote and share knowledge regarding testing and quality. We have organized 6 annual conference. We also organize meetups, and we have just started organizing webinars. For this first webinar series, we have invited our keynote speakers from our past conference editions. So let's get started. A few comments before starting. If you have any comment or question about what Janet will present, please write them in the live comment panel located on the left of your screen. We'll review them at the end of Janet's presentation. And of course, we will upload the webinar on our YouTube channel at the end of streaming. So let's start. We are thrilled and excited to have Janet Gregory today as our special guest. We had the honor and pleasure to have her at the Testimony conference last year. So welcome, Janet.
Thank you.
It's a privilege to have you today. So thanks again for joining us. I will let you present yourself and start. So I will remove myself, and when you start sharing your screen, I will press.
All right. So can somebody post a comment in the to say, I can hear you, I can see you, and I can see the screen? Because I'm not seeing any comments yet. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, the comments are not being streamed in the internal tool. You have to see them in the YouTube. Sorry about that.
All right, and I don't have the YouTube up.
Don't worry, I will read them.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries at all. All right, but everybody can hear me and see me, so that's a good thing. Today's webinar is titled How Team Members Can Collaborate on Technical Tasks. And first of all, I named it wrong. I named that presentation incorrect because, well, that's what happens when you create an abstract before you finish a presentation. So what it should be is, am I technical enough to collaborate with programmers and SREs? And if you have to ask what an SRE is, maybe that's even better. I have to look it up every time because I'm really, really bad with acronyms. SRE is Site Reliability Engineer. In Canada, we can't call them engineers if they're not truly an engineer. So I use the term operation folks. It's just as easy. But before I actually start, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Most of you might know me by the Agile testing books I've co-authored, or the talks I've given, like at Testing Uruguay last year, or maybe other user groups, or maybe you've even attended one of my courses. But like many of you, those days seem a long time ago. The last 2 months, I've been sheltering in place, new term, at our summer home in BC, in British Columbia, Canada. As I've been working and revamping our course, Agile Testing for the whole team, to be facilitated remotely, I was able to watch my bushes bloom. That's those pretty pink flowers on there. And right outside my window, I have a birdhouse, and we're able to watch the birds mate, and they've started building a nest. Really interesting. And I've been doing a little bit of painting myself, butterflies lately. So also lots of thinking and pondering life and enjoying the nature around me. I hope that you all have had that opportunity as well. But back to the presentation. Have you ever said to yourself, I'm not technical enough to join that discussion? Or perhaps somebody else said, that'll be too technical for you. Don't worry about joining. Or maybe you're one of those people that don't think that those, quote, non-technical people can help you with a technical problem. It's these kinds of biases, both internal and towards other people, that make team members miss really important nuances that can lead to a better implementation of a story or a feature. So this talk is about how you can overcome some of those biases, and how by collaborating with others who are different than us makes us all better. I'll talk a wee bit about collaboration and the strategies and tools we can use, and then I'll share ideas about how to use some of these tools for different technical tasks. Hopefully, you'll be able to take some of these ideas and you'll have an opportunity to influence others, and so you can grow ideas together. Before we start, I want you to take a minute or two to think about all the technical tasks that people in your team do. Write them in the chat. I won't be able to see them, which is unfortunate, but I will go back and look at them afterwards. So just take a minute or so. Think about all the tasks that you would consider being technical and write them in the chat. And maybe Claudia can read some of them to me.
Sure. The first one that is mentioned is code review. Another one which is mentioned is performance test. Let me see if another one come up. Pipeline. Another one that Ariel is mentioning is pipeline integration. Rodrigo is mentioning database. Jimena is mentioning services checking. Ruslan is mentioning regression test. Monica is mentioning program script and also see the API. API.
That's okay. All right.
The last one, sorry.
Yeah.
Just because it's mentioned and it's continuous integration and continuous delivery.
Okay. Thank you. I put a list together. There may be some the same, and there is some different, right? Because it's a long list. And when you start to think about what they are, if your own list matched any of these, right, that's good. But I'm sure you had lots that are different. Now, I just want to take like 10 or 15 seconds just thinking it to yourself. What kinds of tasks do you do that are not technical? I'll really bet you don't have too many of those, because a lot of us have different technical abilities, and they're just in different ways. Feel free to ask about any task or anything, and during the Q&A, and I plan on leaving lots of time for questions. So just put them in the chat and Claudia will pick them up and ask them at the end. Okay, so let's talk about collaboration. Collaboration is working together, not one person talking and another listening, but sharing ideas equally. The outcome is probably the completion of a task or a goal, or maybe you're trying to find a solution to a specific problem. Those sorts of things are always, almost always, done better with more than one person. Creating safety and trust in a team is really hard, and I know that. But without it, collaboration will never be as good as it could be, because somebody is going to be sitting on the outside and not volunteering information because they're scared. So try to really create that safety. And that's all I'm saying on that. Now, think about collaboration strategies or tools that you use. I want you to take a minute or so and put these down in the chat, and Claudia will read them out to me as you put them in. What strategies or tools do you use to collaborate with your team?
So, let me check. Ariel is mentioning Confluence document, and Jimena and Lucas are mentioning Slack. Lucas is also mentioning Jira. Ariel is also mentioning pre-deploy meetings. Sergio is mentioning ClickUp. Belen is mentioning Trello. Gustavo is mentioning peer review. Lucas is mentioning code review. Rodrigo is mentioning Confluence, that was also mentioned. Yep. Ruslan is mentioning show and tell meetings. Jimena is mentioning daily stand-up. I think this quality data is mentioning face-to-face. Diego is mentioning shift left meetings. Jeremy is mentioning whiteboard. Lucas is mentioning refinement meetings.
All right.
The last one?
Yep, the last one.
Jimena is mentioning retrospective meetings.
All right, lots of meetings. So I'm just going to put in a little soapbox things. Very few meetings I attend are really collaborative. However, many workshops I attend are very collaborative. When we go into a meeting, we often have that, you sit back in your chair and you listen, and one or two people talk. Meetings tend not to be collaborative. So I like to rename them as workshops, because people come in with a different frame of mind. Just a little something that I've found. Use of a word. So these are some collaboration tools that I kind of wrote down. You've put some of them, the idea of whiteboards, but you can use mind maps, you can use all kinds of different things. There's lots of different collaboration tools, and I saw you folks put a long list together here, and that's really good. Now, I'm hoping that some of you use some of these tools, because they can be, if we're always thinking about meetings or things like Trello that we're collaborating on, we sometimes put ourselves in little boxes and forget the other ways. Also, most of these tools can be done using lo-fi, like whiteboards or flip charts or anything else, but a lot of them can be used for remote working. I am not going to differentiate between the two, because they can be used either way. The 3 collaboration strategies, and so up a level from tools I'm going to talk about today, are visualizing, pairing, and feedback with interaction. And those are kind of the higher level strategies. I'm going to take and look at each one of those and take 2 or 3 different tasks, technical tasks, and I'm going to talk about how you might be able to use that strategy in that task. You might not be able to do it for every specific one, but you can use these and take these ideas away for different tasks that you have. So, visualization. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go back one. We're going to talk about the architecture. We're going to talk a little bit about implementation design and the deployment pipeline. So some of those were mentioned before. But let's start with with architecture. Because I find every time somebody says, let's look at the architecture, it's kind of, I get this little, I don't know enough about that. That's not my strength. So let's talk about that. That's kind of the hard stuff sometimes. If you have no, quote, technical experience, how can you contribute or collaborate on thinking about architecture? I'm going to suggest that anyone can participate. I would start by you making it visible. I would start simple. I want to understand the system on a high level. So perhaps start with a context diagram. By drawing it out, understanding what entities talk to other entities, everybody gets the same understanding. Everybody can ask questions. Sometimes the people with the least amount of knowledge actually ask the best questions because they're not making assumptions. Maybe we'll ask, why are we sending data that way? Doesn't it go both ways? Because it has to, go out to the bus maintenance and it has to come back to the buses in this particular diagram. The details aren't that important. It's asking the questions and getting common understanding. So don't let lack of knowledge stop you from asking questions, because sometimes that's the best way to get those assumptions out in the open and deal with them. Now, perhaps you find yourself looking at an architecture diagram. Some of them get really complicated. This is a fairly simple one from some of the ones I've seen. Instead of sitting back and thinking, it's too hard, it's too difficult, start to look at what it is saying. Compare it to that context diagram you created. Are there any similarities? If so, take and start looking at the details. Where does it start? Where does it grow from there? What questions do you have? Maybe take it to one of the developers or the architects, whatever you have on your teams, and start with what you know. If you start from a place of, I'm trying to learn, everybody will want to help, right? Because you're learning. So start with what you know and then confirm what you suspect, right? Use it as an opportunity to learn something new. Again, ask questions. Now, if you don't have an architecture diagram, and lots of organizations and teams do not, start drawing one. It's a great place to get that common understanding of the system. So you start simple, start with that, what you know, and add complexity. Maybe either take it around. If you're not real brave, take it to your friendly developer and say, this is what I think. Am I on the right track? He or she might say, yeah, you are, but here's some ideas. If you're really brave, call a workshop and say, I would really like to have a high-level architecture diagram. It doesn't need to go real detailed, right? And collaborate on it. Draw it on the whiteboard. Understanding the architecture will help your team code better, make better design decisions, and I know it will help the team test better. And putting it in pictures is the way that I have found to work best, because once it's in a picture, once it's visual, people can actually start to talk about it in the same way. The next thing I'm going to talk about is implementation design. I'm going to talk about using flow diagrams or state diagrams for that. By creating flow diagrams for new features especially, teams can start to think about the best way to implement. I use flow diagrams to slice stories, right? So by visualizing the flow of a feature, you can help to think about what is that simplest thing that we could possibly implement. What is that, most of the time, happy path? What is the core? How can we test that, right? And then you can start asking, what are the complexities? Those complexities are often different scenarios. Sometimes those scenarios can wait till a later release because they're not as important. So by using a visual tool like flow diagrams, all of a sudden you can really start to see what's really important. By collaborating, by making these flows visible and asking questions, you are influencing how that feature is implemented. By starting that high-level discussion and by understanding it at a high level, the next time you go into one of those workshops or start to have a conversation, you will have more information and can even contribute more. If you use other tools, visual aids as such, I'm a fan of state diagrams, data flow diagrams. It is, to me, and I've done this many times, is take a state diagram. What is this going through? What state does it go? What happens? What am I looking at? Because very seldom do we stop and think about that. We don't take the picture. We think, well, it's going to go from here to here. But unless you draw it out, you're going to be missing scenarios. Same with data flow. How does the data flow? These simple tools are very easy to collaborate, right? They're visual, the team can see them, and you can start asking questions in a much more, I lost my word, in a much more concrete way. Show pictures. The last one I'm going to talk about with visualization is deployment pipelines. Somebody put that down as a technical task, is understanding those pipelines, even coding them. The first thing you need to do, if you haven't already, is to visualize it. Everyone has a build pipeline, even if they don't know it. Your basic pipeline might look like this when you start. You have your CI, your continuous integration build environment. You have a development environment, a test environment, staging, and production. Maybe that's as simple as it is, right? You can ask clarifying questions, even if you just put this up on the wall. You can ask things like, is the build always taken from the build box when deployed? Does it include all the configurations with each new build? Are any of those deployments automated? Are they pushes, or can we pull them like I would like to do for the test environment? Then you take that initial picture and you start asking more questions about each environment, because it's really important. And I find that teams, or some of the team members, especially if somebody else has built the pipeline, don't really understand what's going on in each environment. So start asking the questions and say, what tests are run in each environment? For example, what runs in the CI build? What runs in there? Unit tests, API tests, great, right? Keep asking, keep seeking to understand. Smoke tests run in the development environment. Those workflow tests, maybe they run in the automated environment. Maybe you have two environments for running those workflow tests. One for that's run on the automation all on its own, and maybe another one for actual testing in. But understand those environments. You want to keep asking those questions. Ask other questions about what else, what other kinds of tests. I don't see tests for I don't know, performance and load, penetration tests. Where do they go? Are we missing an environment? Should we have a separate environment? Right? So you want to be thinking about and asking these questions to understand. What about things like static code analysis? Where does it go? Should we have a separate environment? Should we be showing the development sandbox, the developer's sandbox, their own work environments on this picture? What about stress tests? Where would we put them? What about all the other kinds of testing, security, exploratory, maybe accessibility? Some of these tests should not be or cannot be automated. So use some other color maybe to differentiate, to say, these are the tests we're going to have that are going to, our exploratory tests. We're going to run them on the test environment, for example, right? But show what it is. So you want to continue that conversation. You want to know exactly what goes on in each individual environment. The next thing you're going to do is eventually you're going to start working towards continuous delivery if you're not already. And over time, that conversation will change if it hasn't already. And you're going to start asking about testing in production. What does that mean? And when you test into production, we're really talking about observability, along with a few other things. That's all about feedback. And as a non-technical tester, you can have a lot of impact by asking questions about what you want to learn from that observability. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's leave the visualization. It's my go-to. Pictures. If you've noticed, even in this webinar, I'm sitting and I have a virtual whiteboard. It makes connections in my brain, and I met a few other people like that as well. So the second collaboration strategy I'm going to talk about is pairing. A few of you talked about peer reviews and different things. It's along the same line. So whether you're pairing or you might be mobbing, right? I'm going to keep talking about pairing here. The three tasks I'm going to talk about are automation, the API level test automation, testing through the user interface for workflows, and a little bit about log files. So when I say test fixture, test methods, maybe step definitions, depends on what tool you use. I'm talking about using those tools at the API or service layer, not necessarily full workflow tests and not unit tests. So when we walk out of our story readiness meetings or our iteration meetings, right? We have we've been working with, we have examples. That's always a great place to start. So we have those examples, and hopefully you've done that in story readiness workshops with the whole team or maybe 3 amigos. These examples become tests, right? And now we want to automate those tests. And that's where the magic happens. If I'm a tester, for example, I would pair with a programmer or maybe an SDET. We would look at the tests together, SDET being automation person. We would determine what that test method might be. We would have a conversation. The conversation would be something like, what will the test result be? What do you expect? How are we going to represent it? What kind of parameters are going to go in? Are we going to pass them? What is that going to look like? Right? And so once you get that test method and understand what that will look like, at least with the parameters and the results, then you can start looking at different examples. So you'll explore those different examples, and you'll think about, do we need more test methods, or can we use the same test method and just put more tests, right? Because tests are really just the test data in many cases, right? Um, and if you can reuse them, that's even better. And then you write the code for the methods. That can be that programmer you were working with and pairing with, or the automation person or SDAT, right? The magic is the magic is when you have that collaboration, because there is so much benefit, so much by that collaboration. So one of them is cleaner code, more testable code. Some other benefits is because the business examples, we start with those examples, are used to guide development. The language in the code, in the production code, is business language. It's easier to understand, and you get your DSL, your domain-specific language, almost for free. And you've started building up that language that people now can use to talk to each other. So just by having these pairings and having these conversations, it's such a win. So even if I didn't know how to code, I can still have a tremendous amount of impact in how that code is written. Now, if we start talking about automation through the UI, through the workflow tests, quite often testers are responsible for automating, and the testers that would be doing this would usually be quite technical, right? So they'd be automating the workflow through the UI. However, if we don't have this pairing, if we don't have people talking and collaborating, the programmers, when they write the code, might not be considering other team members. For example, maybe they choose something which could be really simple, but they use the naming of the elements or the objects and use dynamically created ones, right? I know that a few years ago, when I was working on a team, we had this problem. We were recreating all our test automation, so we made some safety net tests, some workflow tests, and what we ended up doing was every morning we would come in and we would have to fix our tests. So we had maintenance every morning, because if a programmer added a new object in the UI, our tests would break because of all these dynamic IDs. So we went a little while and we realized this is just a waste of our time. So in our retrospective, we said, hey, programmers, could you please name them rather than just using the dynamic, what they'd been using? And they said, sure, not a problem. They'd never even thought about it, hadn't occurred to them. So they started working that way and they started naming them, and life got so much better. But it wasn't perfect because there was still a whole bunch that were in the system. So we came back, we talked about it again, and this time we had a little bit of a discussion. It went back and forth about the pros and cons, and we ended up with a story that said, let's rename all of the existing dynamic IDs. So we did, and we paired with the programmers on this because it became an important thing for us to really understand what was going on. So even if you are technical in one area, you can still have influence on a different piece, right? Lisa Crispin, my co-author and partner in so many things, she tells a story about when they were trying to do acceptance test-driven development, not at the API level, which is where we usually do it, but through the user interface. They wanted to do it for their workflows. Now, this was a very mature team. They'd been working together a long time. So they started thinking about what they would name their objects before they ever started coding. So much harder. And they did run into a few things, but they were able to write that code and have it ready before the production code was written. So there's lots of different ways you can do it, but you have to really understand that testing is a team problem, that some of these things need to be worked out together, not individual. All right, log files, some of our favorite things. So have you ever stared at a log file? I have many, many times. Watched it scroll by while you're doing exploratory testing or looking for something else because you're debugging and trying to find it, but all you see is lines scrolling by. So I'm going to say try something a little bit different. So if you happen to be, say, a tester and you're doing exploratory testing, ask a programmer to compare with you for a little while. Ask them to watch the log files to see if they can tell what's going on, to see if they see anything that's jumping out. How helpful are those log files? Flip side, if you see something weird when you're exploring, did it show up in the log file? Use these conversations with the programmers to get them starting to think about maybe looking and making these log files a little bit easier to look at. I once had a programmer who was very nice and added highlights in the log file. So if there was an error, it went bright red. I could easily see it as it was scrolling by. He put warnings in yellow. Not quite as standoutish, but it was really very helpful for me. So these are just some examples to show that pairing can really have an impact on lots of technical different kinds of tasks. So let's get into our last strategy, feedback and interaction. So interaction, I define it as just listening, questioning, listening some more, maybe asking some more questions, being prepared to give feedback, right? Feedback should always be, well, at least it's very preferable to give in a positive manner. And again, it's not necessarily separate from visualization or pairing, but sometimes we don't recognize what is happening and we lose the opportunity to collaborate effectively. So the two tasks I'll talk about here is design and observability. So let's talk about TDD, unit tests. Quite often that's the programmer's domain, and they don't want to let you in. So here's something that I found kind of works well, is especially if I've never seen code, if I have no idea what a unit test looks like, what TDD is, pick a developer. Probably the one you have the best relationship with. It's a good place to start. Ask to run an experiment on the next story, right? In this case, validating a password. So remember, come with an open mind, be willing to learn. So bring in the high-level acceptance test, because you'll have done this already. Hopefully the team has done this. It's there. So in this case, given I'm in the login page, when I enter a valid password, I'm able to do stuff, right? You could, so that's the expected behavior, right? It's the happy path. This will start the conversation. So I could write a simple flow chart for this. Or maybe I would start and ask a question and say, so my best friend programmer, what would be the very first test you would write? The very first small unit test. And maybe he or she would say, well, assert true, password 123 is greater than 8, because that's one of the rules. It's got to be more than 8 characters. Okay, as a non-technical person, I can understand that. Pretty easy. Then I might ask, what would the pseudocode look like to pass that test? Maybe it would look like this, right? Still pretty simple. If the count is greater than 8, return true, otherwise return false, right? I can read that. I understand what that unit test is going to do and how he or she is going to test it. What would be the next one? Why would that be? Think about how you can contribute. Are there tests that they didn't think of? Would you ask things like, what happens if the password is 200 characters? Do we have an upper limit? Do we care? What happens if we change the rules and 8 is no longer the minimum? Perhaps the programmer who was going to hard code in 8 as a minimum might stop and think, we should really have a constant that says that, so we only need to change it in one place, right? And it's easy to change. So as you start to look at things like TDD, start with something that you can actually contribute, that you can understand. And so it's pretty easy for programmers to write pseudocode like this if you're willing to learn. Now, the pseudocode for the whole test kind of thing might end up being something like that. Really easy, talking about each of those. We know it's much more difficult. There's a whole lot more that goes into it. So I'm going to say that you may want to go one step further. That's a good place to start. And now you can start asking questions like, how are we going to know that the count is greater than 8? How do we show loops? Right? So learning a few of those basic coding constructs, variables, what types are there? Do we are going to pass integers or strings, right? What does this mean? What is a conditional? We use if else, if then else's, right? But what is it like in the language you're using? So even if you don't code, start with a pseudocode, but then graduate, because it will enable you to have a much better conversation with the programmers. And this isn't necessarily just testers. It could be the business analysts or even product owners. Anybody on the team can start this way. So the last thing I want to chat about is observability. The terminology can be quite scary sometimes, right? We use words like aggregated data versus sampled data, right? But the key to observability is logging structured events, usually with some kind of unique ID, so that we can have, so that when we have questions later, we can actually get the answers from the data. We can go in and look at it. Now, if we're thinking about aggregated data, it took me a long time to try to figure out, but I heard this analogy the other day. So if you think about a bus journey in a city, if you want to understand how people use buses in a city, aggregated data will tell you how many travelers, maybe how many travelers take Route 58. But aggregated data has its limitations because it can't tell you answers to deeper questions like how many take a bus into the center from suburb X and then get on another bus, right? Aggregations smooth the data. Sampling is, I'm going to take a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. It also has limitations. But if you don't know how to code events, and I do not know how to code events, but you can start to ask questions. So things like, what kinds of problems might we expect to have? Maybe we can look at problems we've had in the past. What data would have helped us solve those issues faster? That will get you started on thinking about it. If you know the bigger picture, you can offer insight into what might make sense to use aggregated data. So aggregated data uses less storage, so there's benefits for it, right? Or maybe sample data. It's less accurate, but takes less data too. Or maybe we want to log every single event. We want to make sure we have all the data. And if we use a city bus as an example, maybe in a heavy traffic pattern, in the inside of the city where everybody's getting on and off, that zone 1 area, maybe you only need to sample because there are so many people, so many travelers. But if you go out to the suburbs, to zone 4 or 5, right, further out, there are less travelers. So maybe you want to capture it all. So knowing the big picture will help you make some of those decisions. That's where you can have a lot of impact. Or maybe you can suggest starting with a sample of whole journeys and then dig in later if you see some patterns. So quite often, testers make really good, even if they don't have any quote tech, so please don't say you don't have technical abilities, but you can see patterns. And so looking at the results, analyzing those results can be really interesting, and maybe you can pull things out and then think, you know what? We've got samples of this, but we should really, maybe we can dig in here and start collecting it all, right? So a lot of detail gets lost in the aggregation. And so these are things that you want to start understanding is, what does this mean? Because that's where you can really start asking the questions, having impact on what's gathered, and maybe helping to analyze those results. So don't let it scare you. So I'm just going to kind of end up with, please don't be afraid to try. If you find yourself thinking, I can't, or you can't, just really stop and reconsider. We all have capabilities that can help each other. So I feel I'm successful if I get people to think and consider new ideas, right? My technical abilities show up in lots of different ways. For example, remember the painting that I had on that very first introductory slide, the butterflies? There are many technical things I needed to know to be able to do that. I need to know how to mix colors. I need to know different brush strokes. I need to know how to shadow. But when I use my non-technical folks, my friends, I ask them to give me feedback, because they don't necessarily get into the details to say, Janet, you should have used this brush stroke instead. I will get different kinds of feedback. For example, my husband just said the other day on one of my butterflies, Janet, that looks two-dimensional. Why is that? All of a sudden, I can look at it with different eyes and I can make it better. So please don't let the fact that you don't know how to code or instrument the code or write events or do any of those other things stop you. You can definitely contribute to the conversation. Please don't write people off because they don't know. Help them to find a way to have that conversation. We truly are technical in all different ways. So that's the end of the presentation. I encourage you to look me up. You can look me up on the Agile Testing Fellowship or in any of the websites. You can email me. I love to hear from people, so I encourage people to contact me with your questions. But we have at least 10 minutes, maybe more, for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Claudia.
Thank you, Janet. Great presentation as always. Let me check the live comment panel just to see if there are any comments or questions. We have a few comments when you were presenting. We had from Ariane that she mentioned that when you share the slide of the architecture, she mentioned that it's very important to know and understand the architecture to to define the strategy about your testing.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Also, by Ariane, also she mentioned when you were talking about how doing the first start diagram, she mentioned that it's very important to anticipate gaps too before developing starts.
Yes.
And then we have a lot of things. Janet, amazing representation.
Oh.
I think I
No
do like a
questions?
lot of. Let me check if there is another one. Not at this moment.
Okay.
I like the idea of renaming some meetings to workshops to change the mindset before joining them and promote collaboration. I think it's a very easy change to incorporate, and I think it's a very good one because you can change the mindset.
Well, when people go to a workshop, they come to a workshop with the intention of collaborating, right? They're going to contribute. The whole mindset is different, but then you have to keep it moving and really make things happen too. You can't just rename a meeting to a workshop and not make it a workshop.
Yeah, because you are like setting an expectation on how it's going to be delivered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think all the tips and ideas are promoting collaboration in all levels. I do like that idea a lot. Let me check what Gustavo is saying. Gustavo is mentioning the simple idea to exercise those activities with another peer contributes a lot to the quality. And also, Jeremy has a question. The question is, when you collaborate, what is the impact of team size? What methods work with large groups?
Okay, so collaboration, and when you say large groups, I have no idea whether you mean a team of 10 or a team of 20 or a team of, so to me, you can collaborate really effectively with, I don't know, 5 to 7 people. If you start getting 10 or 12 people, all of a sudden there's too many people, you can't make decisions, it gets a lot harder. So you have to have some kind of I don't want to say rules, but some kind of guidelines how you're going to make decisions when you have bigger groups. Sometimes it works better to have 2 smaller groups and collaborate and come together to see what they both come up with, right? So if you have a problem you're trying to solve, maybe do it in 2 separate groups and then come together to try to do it. Because if you get too many, you know that those quiet people are never going to contribute. So you have to be very careful. Good question.
Thanks, Janet. Let me check if there is another one. Okay, it seems that there are no more comments or questions.
Okay.
So thanks again, Janet. It has been a pleasure, as always, and thanks everyone for joining us. Next webinar will be May 26th, and we will have UX expert Kevin Richardson as speaker. Hope you can join us. Thanks again, everyone. See you soon and keep safe. Thank you very much. Buenas noches y buena semana para todos. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.